June 30th, 1944. 12,000 feet above the Pacific, 160 miles north of Saipan. Lieutenant Dale Haberman gripped the controls of his P-61 Black Widow. Two Pratt & Whitney engines pushed 20 tons of metal through complete darkness. Behind him, radar operator Ray Mooney stared at a green phosphorescent scope. A blip appeared. Then another. Contact. 5 miles out, approaching fast. This was the moment everything changed. The Japanese had owned the night for 3 years. Now that was ending. The distance closed. 4 miles. 3. Mooney's voice was steady despite what both men knew. This would be the first kill for the P-61 in the Pacific. The first time America's purpose-built night fighter would prove itself in combat. The Betty's crew was probably relaxed now, thinking themselves safe in the protecting darkness. They were wrong. 2,500 feet. Visual contact. The bomber materialized in the faint moonlight. Haberman closed to 700 feet. Then he opened fire. 8 guns erupted simultaneously. 4 20mm cannons in the belly. 4 50 caliber machine guns in the turret behind the cockpit. Tracer rounds streaked through darkness like meteors. The rounds bracketed the Betty perfectly. The bomber exploded. Fire bloomed orange and white. The shockwave hit Moonhappy like a physical blow. Debris hammered the left engine cowling. Metal fragments pinged off the windscreen, but they were still flying, still in control. The burning wreckage spiraled into the Pacific, trailing smoke and flame. Haberman and Mooney watched it all the way down until it hit the ocean and disappeared in a plume of steam. They were 160 miles from base. 550 gallons of fuel burned. 327 20mm rounds fired. 525 50 caliber rounds expended. 1 Japanese Betty bomber destroyed. Back at Saipan, radio operators had heard everything. The intercom transmissions had been broadcast live to squadron headquarters. Ground controllers had listened to the entire engagement. Mooney's calm vectors, Haberman's terse acknowledgements, the moment of firing, the confirmation of kill. When Haberman and Mooney taxied Moonhappy back to the flight line, a crowd was waiting. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, examining damage from flying through the debris field. The squadron commander shook their hands. Intelligence officers wanted debriefing. Photographers snapped pictures. Someone had recorded the entire engagement on wire recorder. The tapes were already being duplicated for training purposes. But what mattered most was simpler. They had proven the Black Widow worked. America finally had a weapon that owned the night. The story of how that weapon came to exist begins 4 years earlier, on the other side of the world, in a city being methodically destroyed by German bombs. October 1940, London burned. Night after night, Heinkel bombers droned through the darkness, dropping high explosives and incendiaries on a city that couldn't stop them. British night fighters scrambled, but by the time Spitfires and Hurricanes climbed to altitude, vectored by ground radar to intercept positions, the Germans had already dropped their payloads and turned for home. The fighters were fast. They were capable, but they were effectively blind. They had no way to find targets in the darkness except by luck and moonlight. The Luftwaffe had learned a brutal lesson during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, daylight. Bombing raids over England were suicide. British fighters and anti-aircraft guns decimated German formations. Messerschmitt Bf-110 escorts couldn't protect the bombers. The Luftwaffe lost so many aircraft that continued daylight operations became impossible. So German commanders switched tactics. They would bomb at night, when British fighters couldn't find them, when anti-aircraft guns had to fire blind, when the darkness itself became their greatest protection. It worked devastatingly well. Between September 1940 and May 1941, German bombers killed over 43,000 British civilians. 1 in 6 Londoners became homeless. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble. Industrial facilities were destroyed. Transportation infrastructure collapsed. Civilian morale was stretched to breaking point, and Britain had almost no effective defense against the onslaught. The problem wasn't courage. British pilots would gladly fly through darkness to engage enemy bombers. The problem wasn't capability. Spitfires and Hurricanes were excellent aircraft with sufficient performance to destroy German bombers. The problem was fundamental. Finding a bomber in the night sky without any way to see it was nearly impossible. On a moonlit night, under perfect conditions, a pilot might spot an enemy aircraft silhouetted against clouds from 3 miles away, but those perfect conditions were rare. Most nights had broken cloud cover, haze, or were completely overcast. On a moonless night, detection range dropped to under 1,000 yards. At those distances, any evasive maneuver by the bomber could lose it. Forever in the darkness, British scientists had been working on a solution since 1936. They called it radio detection and ranging. Radar, ground-based installations could detect incoming bombers at ranges up to 100 miles and vector fighters toward them. The technology proved crucial during the Battle of Britain, giving Royal Air Force commanders early warning of German attacks. But the radar systems were massive. They required huge antennas and powerful transmitters. They worked brilliantly for ground stations. They couldn't possibly fit in an aircraft. Then in early 1940, British researchers at the University of Birmingham, John Randall and Harry Boot, invented the cavity magnetron. This device generated microwave radiation with unprecedented efficiency, producing wavelengths short enough to allow much smaller antenna designs. For the first time, a complete radar unit could fit inside a fighter aircraft. The cavity magnetron was so revolutionary that the British government classified it above top secret. The device could enable not just airborne radar but countless other applications. It represented a fundamental breakthrough in microwave technology. In August 1940, Lieutenant General Delos Emmons of the United States Army Air Corps arrived in London. He was the American air officer, sent to observe British operations and assess their defense needs. The timing was significant. Germany's daylight bombing campaign was reaching its climax. The Battle of Britain raged in the skies over southern England. On the night of August 15th, Emmons experienced a German bombing raid firsthand. Air raid sirens wailed across London. Citizens scrambled for shelters. Searchlights swept the sky, trying to illuminate bombers for anti-aircraft guns. The guns fired blindly into darkness, hoping to hit something they couldn't see. Explosions tore through buildings. Fires spread across entire neighborhoods. And through it all, the steady drone of German engines, invisible in the darkness. The next morning, exhausted British officials briefed Emmons on their newest weapon system. They demonstrated the cavity magnetron, explaining how it enabled airborne radar through microwave wavelengths. They showed him the prototype AI, airborne intercept radar units, being tested in Bristol Blenheim night fighters. The systems worked, but they were heavy, unreliable, and required specialized aircraft to carry them effectively. Then British officials made a request. Britain desperately needed aircraft. Specifically, they needed a large twin-engine fighter capable of carrying the heavy early radar units, mounting multiple gun turrets for defensive and offensive firepower, and remaining airborne for at least 8 hours of continuous patrol. British industry was stretched to breaking point, producing Spitfires, Hurricanes, and bombers. They lacked capacity to design and manufacture a purpose-built night fighter. Could America help? Emmons understood immediately. The United States Army Air Corps had no night fighters. American doctrine focused entirely on daylight operations, protected by 2 vast oceans. American planners assumed the US would never face the kind of sustained night bombing Britain endured. But Emmons saw beyond the immediate situation. If America entered the war, night fighting capability would be essential. Better to develop it now, learning from British experience, than to need it desperately later. Emmons returned to the United States in September 1940 with detailed specifications and an urgent recommendation. The US Army Air Corps needed to develop a night fighter immediately. Not a modified day fighter with radar bolted on, not a converted bomber pressed into service. A purpose-built aircraft, designed from the ground up to hunt in darkness using radar guidance. The request reached the Air Technical Service Command at Wright Field, Ohio in October 1940. Engineers and procurement officers studied the requirements. The specifications were daunting. The aircraft needed to patrol for 8 hours minimum, requiring enormous fuel capacity. It needed to carry 3 crew members, a pilot to fly the aircraft, a radar operator to track targets and vector the pilot toward them, a gunner to operate defensive turret armament. It needed multiple guns for attacking bombers, both forward-firing weapons and a powered turret for defense. The radar equipment alone weighed hundreds of pounds and required significant electrical power. Early AI radar units consumed more power than the entire electrical system of existing fighters. The aircraft would need generators capable of supporting both normal aircraft systems and power-hungry radar equipment simultaneously. Colonel Lawrence Craigie at Wright Field contacted every major American aircraft manufacturer. Douglas, Northrop, Lockheed, Curtiss, Bell all received the requirements. Design a night fighter capable of meeting these specifications. Jack Northrop had been thinking about this exact problem for months. The British Purchasing Commission had approached him in September about building a night fighter for the Royal Air Force. Northrop, founder of Northrop Aircraft Company in Hawthorne, California, had been sketching preliminary designs for weeks: a large twin-engine fighter, radar in the nose, multiple crew stations, long range, heavy armament. On October 21st, Colonel Craigie telephoned Vladimir Pavleka, Northrop's chief of research. Craigie described the Army's requirements in deliberately vague terms. The aircraft needed to carry a special device that could locate enemy aircraft in the dark, a device that could see other airplanes. Craigie never mentioned radar directly. The technology remained highly classified. He instructed Pavleka not to take written notes, just remember the specifications. Pavleka met with Jack Northrop the next day. They compared what Pavleka remembered from Craigie's call with the specifications the British had provided weeks earlier. The requirements matched almost exactly. Same crew of 3, same 8-hour endurance, same need for heavy armament and radar equipment. The British and Americans wanted the same aircraft. Northrop pulled out the preliminary designs his engineering team had been developing. They refined the specifications, matching them precisely to the Army's requirements. Within days, Northrop submitted a formal proposal. The challenges were enormous. No existing fighter came remotely close to these requirements. The largest American fighters, like the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, were single-seat aircraft focused on speed and maneuverability. They had no space for radar operators or gunners. Their fuel capacity supported maybe 4 hours of flight, not 8. What Northrop was proposing looked more like a medium bomber than a fighter. The preliminary specifications showed an aircraft 45 feet long with a 66-foot wingspan. Fully loaded weight would exceed 22,000 pounds. Many in the Army Air Corps doubted such a large aircraft could function as a fighter at all. Fighters were supposed to be small, fast, agile. This was none of those things. But Jack Northrop understood something fundamental that many others missed. Night fighting wasn't about speed or maneuverability in the traditional sense. It was about finding the enemy before they found you. It was about having weapons capable of destroying them once you did. And it was about staying airborne long enough to patrol the night sky for hours, waiting for that crucial moment of contact. Speed mattered less at night because visual detection ranges were so short. By the time you saw an enemy aircraft, you were already close enough to attack. Maneuverability mattered, but not the kind of violent aerobatics that characterized day fighting. Night fighters needed stable gun platforms and good handling characteristics at the slower speeds of bomber interception. What mattered most was finding the enemy, and that required radar. Everything else in the design served that fundamental purpose. The aircraft needed to be large enough to carry radar equipment and operators. It needed enough electrical power to run the radar continuously. It needed enough fuel to patrol for hours. And it needed enough armament to destroy targets quickly once they were found. On November 5, 1940, Northrop submitted his formal proposal in competition with Douglas Aircraft Company. Douglas proposed the XA-26, a modified version of their A-26 Invader bomber. The Douglas design was conventional, based on proven technology, offering lower development risk. Northrop's design was revolutionary. Twin-boom configuration like no American fighter before it. Central fuselage nacelle housing the crew and armament. Tricycle landing gear when most fighters still used tailwheels. Radar in the nose in a position that provided optimal scanning coverage. Every element of the design served the night fighting mission. The Army evaluated both proposals. On November 5th, they selected Northrop. On December 5th, the Army formally approved the design, designating it the XP-61. On January 10, 1941, Northrop received a contract for 2 prototypes and 2 scale models for wind tunnel testing. Total contract value was not to exceed $1,367,000. The design Jack Northrop submitted was unlike anything in American service. Twin Pratt and Whitney R2800-10 double Wasp engines, each producing 2,000 horsepower, mounted in nacelles that extended into twin tail booms. This configuration placed the engines out on the wings, away from the center of the aircraft, improving stability and providing clear fields of fire for all weapons. The central fuselage nacelle housed 3 crew members in tandem. The pilot sat up front in a greenhouse-style canopy that provided excellent visibility. His instruments included standard flight controls plus a small radar repeater scope that would display targets once the radar operator achieved lock. Behind the pilot sat the gunner in a raised position. He controlled the powered dorsal turret through a sophisticated remote aiming system. A gun sight mounted on his rotating seat allowed him to track targets while the turret followed his aim point. The turret mounted 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns with 560 rounds per gun, providing formidable defensive firepower. The radar operator sat in the rear of the nacelle in his own isolated compartment. He accessed his position through a small hatch on the underside of the aircraft. Inside, he had the SCR-720 radar controls and display scopes. The primary scope showed a planned position indicator display, essentially a top-down view with the P-61 at the center. Enemy aircraft appeared as bright blips that the radar operator tracked by adjusting antenna position and interpreting returns. 420mm. Hispano cannons were mounted in the belly of the central nacelle, firing forward. The guns were positioned low and behind the pilot, which served 2 important purposes. First, it kept muzzle flash away from the pilot's night-adapted vision. Second, it allowed ground crews to service the weapons easily without requiring work platforms. The aircraft's twin-boom configuration was carefully calculated. Wind tunnel testing showed it provided excellent stability. The twin vertical stabilizers gave the aircraft good directional control, and crucially, the configuration allowed the P-61 to fly close to another aircraft's turbulent wake without loss of control, which was essential for positive identification of targets before engaging. The wing design was sophisticated. Northrop used a broad, thick wing that provided excellent lift at low speeds and could accommodate substantial fuel capacity. The wingspan of 66 feet gave the aircraft a wing loading that allowed it to turn surprisingly well for such a large machine. Full-span slotted flaps provided remarkable short-field capability. The flaps could extend to a full 70 degrees, allowing the P-61 to land at speeds barely above 100 miles per hour. This meant the aircraft could operate from relatively short runways, crucial for forward-deployed squadrons operating from hastily prepared airfields. Aileron control was unconventional. Instead of traditional ailerons alone, Northrop used spoilers on top of the wing for roll control. When the pilot turned the control wheel, spoilers would pop up on one wing, disrupting lift and causing the aircraft to roll. This provided crisp, responsive handling even at low speeds. The landing gear was tricycle configuration, with the main gear retracting into the engine nacelles and a steerable nose wheel. This was still relatively uncommon in 1941, when most fighters used tailwheel configurations. But tricycle gear provided better forward visibility during taxi and takeoff, easier ground handling, and eliminated the risk of ground loops that plagued tailwheel aircraft. Fuel capacity was enormous. 4 self-sealing tanks in the wings held a total of 646 gallons. Additional tanks could be installed where the dorsal turret normally sat, extending range even further. External drop tanks on underwing pylons could add more fuel when maximum range was required. The entire aircraft was designed around the SCR-720 radar system. This radar was the American version of British AI Mark X, developed by Bell Telephone Laboratories and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory. It operated at microwave frequencies, using the cavity magnetron technology the British had shared. The SCR-720 could detect aircraft at ranges up to 5 miles in good conditions. The radar operator would search for contacts by rotating the antenna and watching his display scope. When he detected a target, he would lock the antenna onto it and begin calling vectors to the pilot. The pilot would fly the intercept using the radar operator's guidance until close enough to acquire the target on his own smaller scope. At about 5,000 feet range, the pilot's scope would begin showing returns. He would fine-tune his approach, closing the distance while the radar operator confirmed target track and called out range. Visual identification was required before firing, so the pilot would close to within a few thousand feet, sometimes as close as a few hundred feet, to positively identify the target as hostile before opening fire. Development of the XP-61 took over a year. Wind tunnel testing revealed aerodynamic issues that required design modifications. Supply problems forced changes as critical components became unavailable or were diverted to higher priority programs. The Army kept requesting modifications as doctrine and tactical thinking evolved. The biggest challenge was the gun turret. The General Electric remote turret planned for the Black Widow was the same type being installed in the Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber. But B-29 production had absolute priority. Turrets that might have gone to P-61s went to B-29s instead. Many early Black Widows would be built without turrets. Those that got turrets discovered a new problem. When the turret rotated, it created severe buffeting that shook the entire aircraft. The buffeting was worst when the turret pointed directly up or traversed rapidly from side to side. Engineers eventually developed fixes, but many operational squadrons simply removed the turrets and replaced them with fuel tanks. The first XP-61 prototype finally flew on May 26, 1942. Test pilot Vance Breeze took it up from Northrop Field in Hawthorne, California. Despite the aircraft's size and weight, it handled beautifully. Breeze reported excellent stability, crisp control response, and no dangerous handling characteristics. The aircraft could perform rolls, loops, and most aerobatic maneuvers. The only prohibited maneuvers were outside loops, sustained inverted flight, and intentional spins. Test flights revealed both capabilities and limitations. The aircraft was remarkably maneuverable for its size. Pilots discovered it could outturn many single-engine fighters, at least at lower altitudes and speeds. The turning radius was genuinely impressive, but the aircraft was slower than desired. Top speed was around 366 miles per hour at sea level, dropping to around 330 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The climb rate was adequate at low altitude, but became abysmal above 15,000 feet. At 20,000 feet, the aircraft could barely manage 500 feet per minute, about the climb rate of a small single-engine civilian aircraft. This was because the R-2800 engines lacked turbochargers. They were supercharged for low to medium altitude performance, but ran out of power as air density decreased at altitude. The initial tail cone design was a disaster. Made of molded plastic for lightweight, it imploded under high-speed dives. Several test flights nearly ended in crashes when the tail cone collapsed, disrupting airflow over the tail surfaces. Engineers redesigned the tail cone with reinforced structure, solving the problem, but not before several production aircraft had been delivered with the faulty design. Production began in October 1943. The first operational P-61A rolled off the assembly line at Northrop's Hawthorne plant. Early production aircraft were painted in Standard Army Air Force's olive drab over neutral grey. But this colour scheme created problems. During testing, P-61s painted in olive drab showed up clearly under searchlight illumination. Engineers tested 3 paint schemes: olive drab with flat black undersides, all flat black, and all glossy black. The results were dramatic. Under searchlight illumination, the olive drab aircraft was easily visible. The flat black was better, but still detectable. But the glossy black aircraft was nearly invisible. Light that would reflect brilliantly off olive drab or bare metal simply disappeared into the high-gloss black finish. From February 1944 onward, all Black Widows were painted jet black. Those already in service were repainted at depot facilities. The aircraft finally looked the part, a creature of darkness, a predator designed to hunt at night. The Japanese would later call P-61 crews the Black Demons of the Night. German pilots who survived encounters reported huge black aircraft that appeared from nowhere, invisible in darkness. Training began immediately at Orlando Army Air Base in Florida. The first night fighter squadrons formed around the new aircraft: the 492nd Night Fighter Squadron, the 425th, the 6th. Pilots, radar operators, and gunners were trained as integrated crews, learning to coordinate in darkness, trusting instruments and voices over intercoms rather than visual cues. The training was extraordinarily difficult. Night flying was dangerous under the best circumstances. Add complex radar equipment, multiple crew coordination, and combat tactics, and the difficulty multiplied. Crews had to learn radar operation, which was entirely new. They had to practice intercepts in complete darkness, relying entirely on instruments and radar. They had to master crew communication protocols that kept everyone informed without cluttering the radio channels. Radar operators learned to interpret the green phosphorescent blips on their scopes. They learned to distinguish aircraft returns from ground clutter, clouds, and interference. They learned to calculate intercept vectors in their heads while calling instructions to pilots. They learned to track multiple contacts simultaneously and prioritize threats. Pilots learned to fly precise headings and speeds in complete darkness, making smooth coordinated turns based on verbal instructions from radar operators they couldn't see sitting behind them. They learned to acquire targets on their small repeater scopes and close for visual identification without overshooting or losing contact. They learned to identify aircraft silhouettes at night from angles and distances where details were barely visible. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron completed training first. In February 1944, they boarded the RMS Mauretania and shipped to England. They arrived at RAF Charmy Down near Bath, ready to begin operations. Then they discovered their aircraft hadn't arrived. The P-61s were delayed by production problems and shipping complications. Weeks passed with no word. D-Day approached and the squadron remained grounded, their pilots frustrated, their crews idle. When the first Black Widows finally reached England in late May 1944, they triggered an immediate crisis. Several senior generals, including Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg and General Karl Spaatz, declared the P-61 too slow to be effective. The aircraft couldn't catch German bombers at altitude. It couldn't intercept fast fighter bombers. The generals demanded British de Havilland Mosquito night fighters instead. The Royal Air Force agreed. They had been flying Mosquitoes successfully since 1942. The British aircraft was faster, climbing better, and already proven in combat. Why waste scarce resources on an untested American design when proven British aircraft were available? Pilots in the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron erupted in fury. Many threatened to turn in their wings if forced to fly Mosquitoes instead of Black Widows. They had trained for months on the P-61. They believed in the aircraft. They knew its capabilities and limitations. They wanted a chance to prove it worked in combat. General Spaatz ordered a competition. At the end of May 1944, a P-61 from the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron would fly against a Royal Air Force Mosquito NF Mk-17. The test would determine the Black Widow's fate in Europe. If it couldn't match the Mosquito, American night fighter squadrons would transition to British aircraft. The squadron mechanics prepared their P-61 for days. They removed the gun turret to save weight and reduce drag. They fine-tuned the engines for maximum performance. They adjusted every system to peak efficiency. The pilot chosen for the test was aggressive, skilled, and angry at suggestions his aircraft was inadequate. The radar operator was one of the squadron's best. The Mosquito crew, by contrast, had no idea they were in a competition. They thought they were participating in a friendly evaluation of American capabilities. They flew a standard production aircraft with no special preparation or optimization. The test was carefully structured. All flying would be done below 20,000 feet, the altitude range where the P-61 performed best. Above 20,000 feet, the Mosquito's superior high-altitude performance would be decisive. The competition would be run as a dogfight, testing maneuverability and handling rather than the straight-line speed that characterized most night intercepts. The results were predictable, given the test structure. The P-61 proved faster at all altitudes below 20,000 feet. It turned tighter at every altitude, outmaneuvering the Mosquito significantly. Its rate of climb below 20,000 feet was superior. After 2 hours of testing, generals declared the Black Widow the better aircraft for European night fighting operations. Many historians question this conclusion. The test was carefully rigged to favor the P-61's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Above 20,000 feet, where most German bombers operated, the Mosquito was demonstrably superior. In straight-line speed, which mattered for stern chases of fast bombers, the Mosquito was faster. The test proved the P-61 could dogfight, which was almost never required in night fighting. But the test achieved its political purpose. It gave senior officers cover to stick with American aircraft. It convinced American crews that their aircraft was capable, and it allowed Black Widow squadrons to begin operations in Europe. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron's first combat mission came on July 6, 1944, exactly 1 month after D-Day. The target wasn't piloted enemy aircraft. It was V-1 flying bombs, the German revenge weapons that were terrorizing London. The V-1 was a pilotless jet-powered cruise missile. It flew at about 350 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. It carried a 1-ton warhead, and it was difficult to intercept. Its small size made it hard to spot visually. Its speed required intercepting fighters to dive from altitude to match velocity, and its crude guidance system meant it could be flying anywhere within a broad corridor toward London. On July 15th, Lieutenant Hermann Ernst received vectors toward a V-1 crossing the English Channel. He dove from altitude, accelerating to match the flying bomb's speed. At 350 miles per hour in a steep dive, the P-61's plastic rear cone imploded from the aerodynamic pressure. The tail section collapsed. Ernst fought for control and managed to level the aircraft, but the intercept was aborted. The next day, Ernst tried again in an aircraft with the reinforced tail cone. This time everything worked. He closed on the V-1, tracked it through his gun sight, and opened fire. The flying bomb exploded. Ernst and his radar operator, Edward Kopsel, scored the first P-61 kill in the European theatre. Not a manned aircraft, but a robot bomb. Still, it counted. Over the next weeks, Black Widow crews intercepted and destroyed 5 V-1 flying bombs. Each intercept required perfect timing, precise flying, and careful gunnery. The flying bombs didn't maneuver, but hitting them was challenging. They were small, fast, and explosive. Get too close when you hit one, and your own aircraft would be damaged by the blast. By late July, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron moved to Maupertus Airfield in Normandy. The 425th Night Fighter Squadron followed in August. Both squadrons began encountering piloted Luftwaffe aircraft for the first time. On the night of August 14th through 15th, the 422nd scored its first victory over a manned aircraft. A P-61 destroyed a Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine night fighter. Later that same night, Lieutenant Colonel O.B. Johnson, the squadron commander, shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter bomber despite his own P-61 being damaged by anti-aircraft fire. The 425th Night Fighter Squadron scored its first kill shortly afterward. The encounters intensified through the fall of 1944. German bombers still operated at night, trying to strike Allied supply lines and troop concentrations. FW-190 fighter bombers conducted harassment raids against forward airfields. Ju-88s flew both bombing missions and intruder missions against Allied night fighters. The Black Widows hunted them all. Victories came slowly. Most missions ended with no contacts. The Luftwaffe was already being ground down by daylight operations. Enemy aircraft were scarce. When contacts occurred, they were often brief and inconclusive. The target would maneuver and disappear before the P-61 could close for a kill. In October 1944, a P-61 from the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron encountered something unprecedented. A Messerschmitt Me-163, Comet rocket-powered interceptor attempting to land at its base near Brussels. The American pilot tried to intercept, but the Me-163 was gliding too fast even with its rocket motor shut down. The Black Widow couldn't catch it. A week later, another 422nd pilot spotted a Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. He gave chase, but the jet simply accelerated away. The P-61 had no hope of catching it. On another occasion, a Black Widow spotted a Messerschmitt Me-410 Hornisse flying at treetop level. As the P-61 dove to attack, the German pilot saw him coming and opened his throttles. The Me-410 sped away, and the Black Widow couldn't match its speed. These encounters revealed the P-61's fundamental limitation. It wasn't fast enough to catch the latest German aircraft. Jets and rocket planes were beyond its capability. Even advanced piston-engine aircraft like the Me-410 could outrun it when they had warning and room to maneuver. But the Black Widow could still hunt conventional aircraft. U-88 bombers, Heinkel He-111s, transport aircraft. And it was about to get its biggest opportunity. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge erupted in the Ardennes forest. Germany's last major offensive in the West caught Allied forces completely by surprise. Panzer divisions smashed through American lines. Fog and low clouds grounded most Allied aircraft, but night fighters could still operate. The 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons flew constantly, providing air cover over critical positions. 2 P-61s maintained patrol over Bastogne, where American forces were surrounded and fighting desperately. The Black Widows hunted German transports trying to supply forward units. They intercepted bombers targeting Allied positions. They provided the only Allied air presence during some of the battle's darkest days. The battle should have been the Black Widow's finest hour, but chronic shortages of aircraft and spare parts crippled both squadrons. The 422nd had only 4 operational aircraft during much of the battle. Supply lines were disrupted. Spare parts weren't available. Maintenance crews worked around the clock trying to keep even a few aircraft flying. The 422nd flew just 35 sorties in January 1945, when they should have been flying dozens daily. The 425th fared slightly better but still operated well below full strength. Both squadrons spent much of the battle grounded or flying with degraded capability. Despite these limitations, the kills mounted. The 422nd became the top-scoring American night fighter squadron of the war. 43 victories over manned aircraft, 5 over V-1 flying bombs. 3 pilots became aces. Captain Tadas Spellis scored 6 kills. Captain Ray Owens scored 5. Captain Raymond Robillard scored 5. 2 radar operators also achieved ace status, sharing credit with their pilots. The 425th Night Fighter Squadron scored 10 victories over manned aircraft and 4 over V-1s. Lieutenant Cletus Tommy Ormsby was officially credited with 3 victories, though he deserved more. On the night of March 24, 1945, Ormsby and his radar operator were patrolling over Germany. They detected 2 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, obsolete aircraft the Luftwaffe was still using for ground attack. Ormsby attacked and shot both down. Then tragedy struck. Friendly anti-aircraft fire hit Ormsby's P-61. The aircraft went down. Ormsby was killed. His radar operator survived with serious injuries. German surgeons at a military hospital saved the radar operator's life. He later reported that they had successfully engaged and destroyed both Stukas before being shot down. Other 425th crews operating in the area corroborated the claim, but officially, Ormsby was never credited with those final 2 kills. Had he been, he would have been an ace. To this day, veterans of the 425th question why those kills were never recognized. As the war in Europe wound down in early 1945, the Black Widow squadrons shifted tactics. German aircraft became extremely scarce. Most Luftwaffe units were grounded by fuel shortages. The few aircraft still flying were mostly transports trying to evacuate personnel from the Eastern Front. The P-61 squadrons turned to night intruder missions. They ranged across Germany, striking supply lines and transportation infrastructure. The 420mm cannons proved devastating against trains and trucks. Railway locomotives were favorite targets because they showed up clearly on radar, and the cannons could tear them apart. Night after night, Black Widows prowled German skies. Radar operators would search for the distinctive returns of locomotives. Pilots would line up attacks, opening fire from close range. The 20mm explosive rounds would shred the engines, rupturing steam lines and boilers. Entire trains would be destroyed in seconds. This was unglamorous work compared to air-to-air combat, but it was effective. Every destroyed locomotive was one less way for Germany to move troops and supplies. Every wrecked train was a small contribution to Allied victory. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The P-61 squadrons had been in combat for less than a year. In that time, they had destroyed over 50 German aircraft, numerous V-1 flying bombs, and countless ground targets. They had proven the concept of radar-equipped night fighters, and they had provided critical air defense during some of the war's most desperate moments. But the real story of the Black Widow was unfolding thousands of miles away, in the vast expanse of the Pacific. The Pacific Theater presented unique challenges for night fighters. The distances were enormous. Islands were scattered across millions of square miles of ocean. Weather was unpredictable and often violent. Supply lines were stretched thin, and Japanese tactics emphasized lone bombers conducting harassment raids at night. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron was first to receive P-61s in the Pacific. They had been flying P-70s, converted A-20 Havoc bombers that were barely functional as night fighters. The P-70s couldn't climb high enough to intercept Japanese bombers at altitude. Their radar was unreliable. Maintenance was a nightmare. Pilots hated them. When the first Black Widows arrived in early May 1944, it was like Christmas for the squadron. The aircraft were assembled on Hawaii, flight tested, and prepared for deployment. Pilots transitioned from P-70s to P-61s, marveling at the difference. The Black Widow climbed faster. It was more maneuverable. The radar actually worked. It was a real night fighter instead of a barely functional improvisation. The squadron deployed to Saipan in June 1944, arriving just as American forces secured the island. Japanese bombers were already conducting nightly raids, trying to disrupt the American buildup. The P-61s were thrown into combat immediately, with barely any time to settle in. Lieutenant Dale Haberman and radar operator Ray Mooney flew that first mission on June 30th. Their successful intercept of the Betty bomber validated everything the Black Widow was designed to do. More importantly, it announced to the Japanese that the Americans now had effective night fighters. More squadrons followed: the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, the 419th, the 547th, the 548th. By the end of the war, 8 Black Widow squadrons operated in the Pacific, split between the 5th, 7th, and 13th Air Forces. They operated from bases scattered across the Central and Southwest Pacific. The missions were long and often tedious. Pilots would take off at sunset and patrol for 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours. Most nights ended with no enemy contacts. The Japanese learned quickly that American night fighters were active. They reduced night operations significantly. But when contacts did occur, they often came in groups. Lieutenant Carroll Smith of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron became the only American night fighter ace in the Pacific. He scored 7 confirmed kills between October 1944 and January 1945, all while flying P-61s over the Philippines. Smith and his radar operator, Lieutenant Philip Porter, worked together perfectly, their coordination honed by months of training and combat missions. On December 30th, 1944, Smith and Porter encountered a Japanese Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter over Mindoro. The Frank was one of Japan's best fighters, fast and maneuverable. But at night, with American radar guiding the attack, it didn't matter. Smith closed to within a few hundred feet, identified the target positively, and opened fire. The Frank exploded. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron scored 16 confirmed kills by war's end, making it the second highest scoring American night fighter unit. Lieutenant Robert Ferguson flew the Virgin Widow, a P-61A that became famous for its distinctive nose art and combat record. On Christmas night 1944, Ferguson intercepted multiple Japanese bombers attacking Saipan, destroying several in rapid succession. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron scored 18 kills total, the highest in the Pacific. The 419th scored several. The 547th and 548th also recorded multiple victories. Across all Pacific squadrons, Black Widows destroyed 64 Japanese aircraft by the war's end. But the most famous mission came on the last 2 nights of the war. Lieutenant Lee Kendall piloted Lady in the Dark, a P-61B assigned to the 548th Night Fighter Squadron. The aircraft was painted with elaborate nose art and became one of the most photographed Black Widows in theatre. On August 14, 1945, Japan announced acceptance of surrender terms. The war was officially over. But nobody knew if all Japanese forces had received the message or would comply. American commanders ordered night fighters to continue patrols, watching for aircraft that might not know the war had ended or might be attempting final desperate attacks. That night, Kendall and radar operator John Shearer detected a contact, a Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter. Kendall pursued. The Japanese pilot spotted the Black Widow and dove for the ocean surface, beginning violent evasive maneuvers just above the wave tops. Kendall stayed with him. The Oscar pilot threw his aircraft through increasingly desperate turns, trying to shake the American fighter. But the P-61's radar maintained lock. Kendall matched every maneuver, staying on the Japanese fighter's tail in complete darkness. The Oscar pilot grew more frantic. He pushed his aircraft to its limits, turning so hard and so low that a single mistake would send him into the ocean. Finally, he made that mistake. The fighter's wing touched a wave. The aircraft cartwheeled and exploded in a massive fireball. Kendall never fired a shot. He had forced an enemy aircraft to crash through sheer persistence and superior technology. The next night, August 15th, Kendall and Shearer flew again. The war was supposed to be over. All combat operations had officially ceased, but they were ordered to patrol anyway. They detected another contact, a Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo fighter, apparently unaware the war had ended, or choosing to ignore it. This engagement became a wild, maneuvering battle through darkness. The Tojo pilot knew he was being tracked. He began the same kind of violent, evasive maneuvers the Oscar pilot had attempted. Kendall and Shearer pursued. They lost radar contact, reacquired it, lost it again. The battle raged through the night sky for nearly 30 minutes. Finally, Kendall and Shearer lost contact permanently. The Tojo had either escaped or crashed. They returned to base uncertain of the outcome. The next day, Army ground forces found the Tojo's wreckage. The pilot had flown into terrain while maneuvering to evade the Black Widow. These were the last 2 aerial kills by American forces in World War II. Technically, unofficial because they occurred after Japan's surrender, but Kendall and Shearer knew what they had accomplished. They had flown the final missions of the Night War. They had ended it the same way it had begun for the Black Widow, hunting enemy aircraft through darkness using radar and skill. Across all theaters, Black Widow squadrons destroyed 127 enemy aircraft and 18 V-1 flying bombs. The total might seem modest compared to day fighters that scored thousands of kills, but the comparison misses the point. Night fighters operated under completely different conditions. They flew alone. They hunted individual targets through vast volumes of black sky. Each kill required finding a single aircraft among millions of cubic miles of darkness, identifying it positively despite severely limited visibility, closing to weapons range without losing contact, and destroying it before it could escape. The fact that Black Widow crews achieved 127 such kills in barely 1 year of combat operations is remarkable. The aircraft entered service in July 1944. The war ended in August 1945. 13 months of combat operations. That averages nearly 10 kills per month across all squadrons in all theatres, which represents consistent effectiveness given the difficulty of night operations. But the statistics don't capture the aircraft's true impact. The P-61 forced the enemy to fear darkness. Japanese bombers that once roamed freely at night now knew American fighters could find them. German pilots who considered night hours safe learned otherwise. The psychological effect was immense and unmeasurable. Enemy bombers flew fewer night missions. When they did fly, they flew more conservatively, at higher altitudes where they were less accurate. They spent fuel and effort on evasive maneuvers rather than optimizing their attacks. All of this reduced their effectiveness, even when Black Widows didn't actually shoot them down. The aircraft also pioneered technology that would define the future of air warfare. The SCR-720 radar, troublesome and temperamental as it often was, represented the beginning of airborne radar that would eventually become standard on all military aircraft. Every modern fighter carries descendants of that crude early radar. The concept of using electronic sensors to find targets beyond visual range evolved directly from the Black Widow's systems. The idea of a dedicated night fighter and all-weather interceptor likewise evolved into the jet-powered interceptors of the Cold War. The Northrop F-89 Scorpion, direct descendant of the P-61, carried forward the twin-boom configuration and radar-guided interception concept. The Lockheed F-94 Starfire, the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger all trace their operational concepts back to the Black Widow. Even aircraft like the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, which became one of the most successful fighters of all time, carried forward ideas pioneered by the P-61. Multiple crew members, including a dedicated radar operator, heavy armament, all-weather capability, beyond visual range intercept using radar. All of these concepts were proven in combat by Black Widow crews in World War II. After the war ended, P-61s continued flying in various roles. 36 aircraft were converted to F-15 reporter reconnaissance platforms, mounting cameras in modified noses. These aircraft conducted photographic mapping missions across the Pacific, creating the first comprehensive aerial survey of many island chains. Many P-61s participated in the National Thunderstorm Project, a pioneering meteorological research effort. Their radar allowed them to detect thunderstorms. Their stable flight characteristics allowed them to penetrate severe weather that would destroy lighter aircraft. Scientists used instrumented Black Widows to gather data about thunderstorm formation, wind patterns, and electrical phenomena. This research contributed directly to modern understanding of severe weather. The Air Defense Command kept P-61s in service as interceptors until 1948. Squadrons were stationed at bases across the United States, Alaska, and Panama, providing air defense against potential Soviet bomber attacks. The aircraft flew regular patrols and conducted intercept training, maintaining readiness against threats that never materialized. In 1948, the Air Force began replacing P-61s with F-82 twin Mustangs. The F-82 was faster and had longer range, making it better suited for the vast distances of Alaska and the Pacific approaches. Most P-61s were quickly retired and scrapped. A few continued flying test missions or served as trainers. The last operational Black Widow squadron in the Pacific flew from Japan until May 1950. 1 month later, North Korea invaded South Korea and the Korean War began. Had the Black Widows remained in service just a bit longer, they might have seen combat again. Some did participate in the war indirectly. The photographic mapping they had conducted of the Korean peninsula proved invaluable for planning operations. Only 4 complete P-61 Black Widows survive today. One is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. It's painted to represent Moonlight Serenade of the 550th Night Fighter Squadron. One is at the Smithsonian Institution's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. This is a P-61C model. the improved version with turbocharged engines that achieved higher speeds and better altitude performance. It never saw combat because the war ended before production was complete. One is under restoration at the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania. This aircraft has been under restoration for years, with the goal of eventually returning it to flying condition. It would be the only flying Black Widow in the world. The fourth is in the Beijing Air and Space Museum in China. This aircraft was apparently taken by communist forces at the end of World War II and has remained in China ever since. These 4 survivors represent all that remains, physically, of the 706 Black Widows produced. But the aircraft's legacy extends far beyond preserved examples. The P-61 represented something fundamental about American industrial and technological capacity in World War II. When Britain requested a night fighter in 1940, America responded by creating the world's first purpose-built radar-equipped night interceptor. Jack Northrop and his small company in Hawthorne, California, designed an entirely new category of aircraft from nothing. They brought it from concept to combat-ready production in under 4 years. They fielded a weapon that fundamentally changed the nature of air warfare. The aircraft had significant limitations. It was slower than desired. Its climb rate at altitude was poor. It arrived late in the war. Production numbers were modest, but it worked. More importantly, it proved that technology could solve problems previously considered unsolvable. If you couldn't see the enemy at night, you built a machine that could. If darkness protected bombers, you created a weapon that hunted in darkness better than prey could hide. If traditional fighter design couldn't accommodate the equipment required, you created a new kind of fighter that could. The men who flew Black Widows understood this at a visceral level. Every pilot who climbed into that greenhouse canopy, every radar operator who descended into the isolated compartment to stare at glowing scopes, every gunner who sat in the raised position controlling the dorsal turret. They were testing more than an aircraft. They were proving that human ingenuity, backed by industrial capacity, could create solutions to any problem. Lieutenant Dale Haberman, diving through debris after destroying that Betty bomber on June 30th, 1944, understood. He had just proven that American technology worked, that radar-guided interception was real, that the concept of owning the night through sensors and weapons was viable. Lieutenant Herman Ernst, scoring that first V-1 kill over England in July 1944, understood. He had just demonstrated that even robot weapons, flying faster than most aircraft could match, were vulnerable to a properly equipped and trained night fighter crew. Lieutenant Lee Kendall, forcing 2 Japanese fighters to crash on the last nights of the war, understood. He was demonstrating that the technology had become so effective that simply being pursued by a Black Widow was enough to destroy enemy aircraft. They would rather crash trying to escape than risk engaging. The Japanese called P-61 crews the Black Demons of the Night. German pilots who survived encounters reported huge black aircraft that appeared from nowhere, guided by some uncanny sense that could find them in total darkness. The Americans called it the Beast, a creature of technology that hunted through darkness with predatory efficiency. All of them understood the fundamental truth the Black Widow represented. Technology had eliminated one of warfare's oldest advantages. Darkness no longer protected anyone. Night was no longer safe. The side with better sensors and better weapons owned every hour of every day. 127 confirmed kills across 13 months of combat might seem modest in the broader context of World War II air operations, but each of those kills represented hours of patrol through darkness. Perfect crew coordination between pilot, radar operator, and sometimes gunner. Precise radar work to detect, track, and vector onto targets. Careful visual identification to confirm hostility before firing. Accurate gunnery to destroy targets before they could escape. All of this performed in complete darkness, often in poor weather, with no margin for error. Each kill was a Japanese bomber that never reached American positions, a German fighter bomber that never struck Allied supply lines, a V-1 flying bomb that never hit London, a transport aircraft that never delivered critical supplies. Each kill contributed incrementally to Allied victory. More importantly, each kill reinforced the lesson. The night was no longer safe for the enemy. American technology had created a weapon that dominated hours previously considered beyond the reach of air power. That psychological impact was impossible to quantify, but certainly significant. The Black Widow flew in combat for only 13 months. In that time, it fundamentally altered the nature of aerial warfare. It demonstrated that technology could overcome the limitations of human senses. It showed that dedicated purpose-built weapons designed for specific missions could outperform adapted existing designs. It revealed that the future of air combat would be fought around the clock using electronic sensors to find targets human eyes could never see. And it proved something deeper about industrial warfare in the modern era. The side with capacity to develop new technologies, manufacture complex weapons, train specialized crews, and deploy them globally was the side that would dominate. The Black Widow wasn't just an aircraft. It was a statement. America could outthink, outbuild, and outfight any opponent. When the last P-61 was retired from military service in 1954, it marked the end of an era. Jet aircraft with more sophisticated radar systems were already taking over the night fighting mission. The technology pioneered by the Black Widow had evolved into something more capable, but the fundamental concepts remained. All-weather interceptors continued patrolling night skies. Radar continued guiding fighters to targets. Electronic sensors continued replacing human eyes. The mission the Black Widow pioneered continues today in aircraft like the F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, and F-35 Lightning II. The surviving crew members, those few who remain, carry memories of hunting through absolute darkness, of trusting instruments and radar scopes and voices over crackling intercoms, of watching enemy aircraft explode in their gun sights and knowing they had saved lives on the ground, of mastering a new kind of warfare that previous generations couldn't have imagined, of owning the night when everyone said it couldn't be done. They proved it could be done. They proved that darkness was no longer protection. They proved that technology, backed by training and determination, could eliminate advantages that had existed throughout human history. And in doing so, they wrote a chapter in military aviation that continues to influence every fighter aircraft developed since.